The deck of the USS Essex trembled as another Hellcat fighter roared into the sky, its engine screaming defiance across the Pacific waters. Commander Douglas Whitmore watched from the island's superstructure as his air wing, 90 aircraft strong, formed up in the morning light like a swarm of steel locusts preparing to descend on their prey. Below him, on the Japanese-held island of Truk, Admiral Kobayashi stared through his binoculars at the horizon, counting the American carrier silhouettes. His hands shook slightly. There were 8 of them, 8 massive carriers where Japan could barely keep 3 operational. He didn't know that this armada represented just the beginning. He didn't know that American shipyards were launching a new Essex-Class carrier every few weeks. He didn't know his entire fleet was about to be torn apart by a level of naval aviation power the world had never witnessed. But as the first bombs began to fall on his anchorage, one question burned in his mind. How had America built an aerial juggernaut so vast that even the gods of war would tremble? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of how the Essex-class aircraft carriers stunned Japan and changed the course of the Pacific War begins not in the heat of battle, but in the cold calculations of American naval architects in 1940. The United States Navy had watched with growing alarm as tensions with Japan escalated throughout the late 1930s. Intelligence reports painted a disturbing picture of Japanese naval expansion, particularly their development of large fleet carriers like the Shokaku and Zuikaku. American planners understood that any future conflict in the Pacific would be decided by aircraft carriers, those floating air bases that could project power across thousands of miles of ocean. The problem was that the existing American carrier fleet, built under the restrictions of international naval treaties, was simply too small and too limited to fight a sustained campaign across the vast Pacific theater. Commander Richard Hayes sat in the Bureau of Ships office in Washington during the autumn of 1940, reviewing preliminary designs for what would become the Essex-Class. Hayes had served on the carrier USS Yorktown and understood intimately what naval aviators needed. The existing carriers were fine ships, but they had been designed with treaty limitations in mind, restrictions on tonnage and dimensions that compromised their effectiveness. Now, with war clouds gathering and treaty restrictions effectively abandoned, Hayes and his colleagues had the opportunity to design the ideal fleet carrier, one built for sustained offensive operations without artificial constraints. The design that emerged from countless meetings and calculations was revolutionary in its ambition. The Essex-class would displace 27,000 tons, far larger than previous American carriers. More importantly, they would carry an air wing of over 90 aircraft, nearly double the capacity of earlier designs. The flight deck would stretch 872 feet, providing ample space for rapid launch and recovery operations. What truly set the Essex design apart was not just size, but systematic engineering that prioritized operational efficiency and survivability. Hayes insisted on multiple aircraft elevators, allowing planes to move rapidly between the hangar deck and flight deck. The ships would have powerful catapults to help launch heavily loaded bombers. Fuel capacity was enormous, allowing the carriers to steam for thousands of miles without refueling. Perhaps most critically, the Essex-class incorporated lessons learned from combat reports and British carrier experience. The ships featured extensive armor protection around vital spaces, multiple redundant systems, and sophisticated damage control capabilities. These were not just carriers, they were resilient weapons platforms designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. By December 1941, when Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the first Essex-class carrier was already under construction at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. The attack, devastating as it was, proved that every calculation behind the Essex program had been correct. The age of the battleship had ended at Pearl Harbor, where 8 American battleships had been sunk or damaged while they sat at anchor, helpless against aerial assault. The future belonged to the aircraft carrier, and the United States was about to build them in numbers that would astound the world. The Japanese Navy that struck Pearl Harbor was the finest carrier force ever assembled to that point in history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had created the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, and wielded it with devastating effectiveness. 6 fleet carriers had approached Hawaii undetected, launched their aircraft in perfect coordination, and crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Japanese carrier doctrine, refined through years of intensive training and combat in China, seemed unbeatable. Their pilots were superb, their aircraft, like the famous Zero fighter, were excellent, and their operational experience exceeded anything the Americans could match. Japanese naval officers believed their superiority in carrier warfare was a decisive advantage that would allow them to hold their newly conquered empire against any American counterattack. After all, it would take years for America to rebuild its shattered fleet. Or so Japanese planners assumed. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was the sheer scale of American industrial mobilization. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had factories, shipyards, and resources beyond anything Japan could match. By early 1942, American shipyards weren't just repairing damaged ships, they were expanding at a frantic pace to build entirely new fleets. The Essex-Class carrier program went from urgent to critical. Where originally the Navy had planned for a relatively modest number of these carriers, the desperate situation in the Pacific led to orders for dozens of them. Shipyards from Virginia to California began laying keels for Essex-Class carriers at a pace that seemed impossible. Newport News Shipbuilding, New York Naval Shipyard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Bethlehem Steel's Four River Shipyard, and others all received contracts. The challenge was enormous. Each Essex-Class carrier required millions of man-hours to construct, thousands of tons of steel, complex machinery, electronics, and weapons systems. Yet American industry rose to meet that challenge with breathtaking efficiency. Lieutenant Raymond Foster walked through the Newport News shipyard in March 1942 and marveled at the organized chaos surrounding him. The hull of USS Essex rose before him like a steel cliff, surrounded by scaffolding and cranes. Thousands of workers, men and women both, swarmed over the structure. Welders sent showers of sparks cascading down the hull. Riveters created a constant thunderous percussion. Massive sections of armor plate swung through the air on crane cables. Foster was an engineering officer assigned to the Essex's crew, sent to the shipyard to familiarize himself with the ship during construction. What impressed him most was how the shipyard had systematized the construction process. Rather than building each carrier as a unique project, they had broken down construction into modular sections that could be prefabricated and assembled. Sections of hull were built separately, complete with wiring, piping, and equipment, then lifted into place and welded together. This modular construction approach dramatically accelerated the building process. Foster climbed a ladder to the flight deck level and stood where hundreds of aircraft would soon launch into combat. The wooden flight deck was being laid over the steel structure, providing a surface that could be quickly repaired if damaged. Looking aft, he could see the massive hangar deck below, a cavern large enough to hold dozens of aircraft. The ship's island superstructure was rising on the starboard side, bristling with gun positions and radar antennae. Every aspect of the design spoke to one purpose: projecting devastating air power across the Pacific. By December 1942, less than 18 months after her keel was laid, USS Essex was commissioned and ready for service. The speed of her construction was remarkable, but even more remarkable was the fact that she was just the first. Behind her, sister ships at various stages of completion filled American shipyards. USS Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, was nearing completion. USS Intrepid, USS Hornet, USS Wasp, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Lexington were all under construction. The pipeline of new carriers had become a flood. The Japanese Navy had no equivalent production program. Japan's industrial capacity, strained by war in China and now spread across a vast Pacific empire, could not match American output. When a Japanese carrier was sunk, it represented an irreplaceable loss. Japanese shipyards simply could not produce fleet carriers at a rate sufficient to replace combat losses. Moreover, Japan faced growing shortages of critical materials, particularly oil and high-grade steel. Every major warship had to be carefully husbanded because there would be no massive fleet arriving to replace losses. This fundamental imbalance in industrial capacity would prove decisive, but in early 1943, with Japan still holding most of its conquests, the outcome was far from certain. American carrier forces had won crucial victories at Coral Sea and Midway, halting Japanese expansion, but the Imperial Japanese Navy remained a formidable threat. The question was whether America's industrial might could be translated into operational victories before Japan consolidated its defensive perimeter. USS Essex arrived in Pearl Harbor in May 1943, and her arrival marked a turning point that few fully appreciated at the time. She wasn't alone. USS Yorktown arrived shortly after. These massive new carriers dwarfed the earlier American carriers, and their air wings were substantially larger and more capable. Commander Douglas Whitmore, the air group commander aboard Essex, assembled his pilots for their first briefing in the combat zone. Whitmore was a veteran naval aviator who had flown from USS Saratoga during the early desperate months of the war. He had seen friends die, had barely survived combat himself, and understood exactly what his young pilots were about to face. Looking at the assembled aviators, some barely 20 years old, Whitmore chose his words carefully. They were going to take the fight to the Japanese, he told them, not defensively protecting islands, but offensively striking at Japanese bases and fleets wherever they could be found. The Essex and her sisters were built for offensive power projection, and that's exactly how they would be used. The aircraft that filled Essex's hangar and flight deck represented the next generation of American naval aviation. The days of the stubby F-4F Wildcat fighter, brave but outmatched by Japanese Zeros, were ending. Now, American carriers deployed the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically designed to counter the Zero. The Hellcat was faster, more durable, and packed heavier firepower than any previous American carrier fighter. For dive bombing, the new SB-2C Helldiver offered greater range and payload than the venerable Dauntless that had won at Midway. The TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, already proven in combat, rounded out the air wing. An Essex-Class carrier could launch a strike package of over 50 aircraft, more planes than many nations possessed in their entire air force. When multiple Essex-Class carriers operated together, their combined air power was staggering. The organizational structure that emerged around the Essex-Class was as important as the ships themselves. The U.S. Navy developed the concept of the Fast Carrier Task Force, where multiple carriers operated together, screened by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all capable of sustained high-speed operations. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, would become the most powerful naval striking force in history, built around Essex-Class carriers. The task force operated with a flexibility and reach that the Japanese simply could not counter. They could strike targets 1,000 miles away, then withdraw before Japanese forces could respond. If the Japanese fleet sortied to engage them, American submarines and patrol aircraft would detect the movement, allowing the carriers to either engage or evade as circumstances dictated. This operational flexibility, combined with overwhelming numbers, created a situation where Japan was constantly reacting to American initiatives rather than executing its own strategy. The first major operation for the Essex-Class carriers came in September 1943 with raids on Marcus Island. It was a relatively minor target, but the raid served as a shakedown for the new carriers and their air wings. Whitmore led the strike from Essex, and what he observed filled him with confidence. The launch went smoothly, with aircraft roaring off the deck in rapid succession. Navigation was precise. The strike arrived on target exactly on schedule. The attack itself was devastating. American fighters swept away the few Japanese planes that rose to intercept, while bombers plastered the island's facilities. Most importantly, the recovery of returning aircraft was efficient, with all planes safely back aboard despite some combat damage. The raid proved that the Essex-Class and its air wings could execute complex offensive operations with professional competence. By November 1943, the U.S. Navy was ready for a far more ambitious operation, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, specifically Tarawa and Makin. Essex and other carriers of Task Force 50 would provide air cover for the invasion force, suppress Japanese defenses, and protect against any Japanese naval counterattack. The assault on Tarawa would prove one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, but from the carrier perspective, the operation demonstrated the power of concentrated naval aviation. Whitmore and his pilots flew strike after strike against Japanese positions on Betio Island, trying to soften defenses before the Marines went ashore. The intensity of operations was grueling. Aircraft launched before dawn, struck Japanese positions, recovered, were rearmed and refueled, then launched again. Pilots flew 3 or 4 missions per day. The deck crews worked in brutal heat, manhandling bombs and torpedoes, refueling aircraft, performing rapid repairs. Despite heavy air support, the Marines faced fierce resistance when they landed on Tarawa. The Japanese garrison had built formidable defenses that survived the bombardment. But where the Essex-Class truly proved its worth was in sustained operations. Day after day, the carriers kept aircraft overhead, providing close air support for the embattled Marines, striking Japanese reinforcements, maintaining combat air patrol to intercept any Japanese air attacks. The Japanese tried to respond, launching airstrikes from bases in the Marshall Islands. These attacks were detected early by radar, and Hellcat fighters from the carriers intercepted them far from the American fleet. The resulting air battles were one-sided slaughters. Japanese pilots, many now hastily trained replacements for veterans lost in earlier battles, were simply outmatched by better American aircraft, better trained American pilots, and superior American tactics. The Hellcats' advantages in speed, durability, and firepower proved decisive in engagement after engagement. Admiral Kobayashi, commanding Japanese forces in the Marshall Islands, read the battle reports from the Gilberts with growing dread. His pilots reported facing not 1 or 2 American carriers, but many, with air wings far larger than intelligence had suggested. The Americans seemed able to keep continuous patrols overhead, to launch massive strikes, to defend their fleet against all attacks. Most disturbing were the reports of new American tactics. The Americans had developed a technique called the fighter sweep, where large formations of Hellcats would arrive over Japanese bases ahead of the bombers, engaging and destroying Japanese fighters before they could interfere with the attack. This tactic systematically eroded Japanese air strength, as defending fighters were either destroyed in the air or forced to stay on the ground while American bombers demolished their bases. Kobayashi understood that he was watching a fundamental shift in the Pacific balance of power. American industry had produced weapons in such quantities that Japanese skill and courage alone could not overcome the material disadvantage. The realization was particularly bitter because Japanese naval aviation had begun the war with genuine qualitative superiority. The Zero fighter, when it first appeared, had shocked Allied forces with its performance and agility. Japanese pilots had been superbly trained, many with combat experience from China. Japanese carrier doctrine had been refined through years of exercises in combat. That superiority had been squandered through attrition. At Midway, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and many veteran pilots. At Guadalcanal, a grinding campaign of attrition wore away Japanese air strength. By late 1943, the Japanese training program could not replace losses with pilots of equivalent skill. Where American pilots trained for over a year before combat, flying hundreds of hours in advanced trainers, Japanese pilot training had been compressed to barely 6 months, with far fewer flying hours. The result was predictable. In air combat, experience and skill matter, and increasingly Japanese pilots had neither in sufficient measure. The American advance continued in early 1944 with Operation Flintlock, the invasion of the Marshall Islands. The Essex-Class carriers USS Yorktown, USS Enterprise, USS Intrepid, USS Cabot, and USS Essex herself formed the core of Task Force 58. Joining them were the light carriers USS Monterey, USS Belleau Wood, and USS Cowpens, creating a force of staggering power. This armada could launch over 500 aircraft in a coordinated strike. Admiral Mitcher, commanding the task force from USS Yorktown, planned to use this power in a way that would shock Japanese defenders. Rather than simply supporting the invasion forces, the carriers would conduct a devastating preemptive strike on the major Japanese naval base at Truk in the Caroline Islands, hundreds of miles from the invasion area. Truk was Japan's main forward base in the Central Pacific, often called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It housed major fleet units, dozens of support vessels, and substantial air forces. The raid on Truk, conducted on February 17th and 18th, 1944, became one of the most successful carrier operations in naval history. The Japanese had no warning. Their radar detected incoming aircraft, but they had no idea of the scale of the attack until the sky filled with American planes. Whitmore led Essex's first strike wave, which arrived over Truk just after dawn. The sight that greeted him was a target-rich environment. The lagoon was packed with Japanese shipping, merchant vessels, tankers, and warships, all anchored in what they had thought was a safe harbor. Japanese aircraft were parked on airfields around the atoll. Whitmore detailed his fighters to sweep the airfields while his bombers went after the ships. What followed was systematic destruction. Hellcats strafed Japanese planes on the ground, destroying them before they could take off. Dive bombers screamed down on ships in the anchorage, their bombs ripping through decks and hulls. Torpedo planes skimmed across the water, their torpedoes leaving white wakes as they ran straight and true into target after target. Wave after wave of American aircraft pummeled truck throughout the day. By evening, the lagoon was a scene of devastation. Dozens of ships were sinking or burning. The Japanese light cruiser Katori had been caught attempting to flee and was sent to the bottom by torpedo bombers. Coastal defense vessels, submarine tenders, tankers, freighters, and dozens of smaller craft joined her. On the airfields, wrecked Japanese aircraft smoldered, twisted metal that would never fly again. The Americans lost only 25 aircraft, a remarkably light toll considering the scale of the operation. For Japan, the losses were irreplaceable. Truk, once a major fleet base, had been neutralized as an offensive threat. More importantly, the raid demonstrated that no Japanese base was safe from American carrier power. The range and striking power of the Essex-Class carriers meant that the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer count on secure rear areas where their forces could rest and refit. Admiral Kobayashi survived the Truk raid by pure chance, having been at sea when the attack occurred. Returning to the devastated base, he walked through the ruins with a sense of fatalistic acceptance. The Americans had announced their presence with overwhelming force. The ships burning in the lagoon represented not just tactical losses, but strategic defeat. Japan's defensive perimeter was collapsing not through ground combat, but through American ability to project naval air power across vast distances. The Essex-Class carriers were the instruments of that projection, and Japan had no answer to them. The few Japanese carriers still operational, the Zuikaku, Shokaku, and smaller vessels, could not possibly match the growing American carrier fleet. Even if they sought battle, Japanese carriers now operated with air wings significantly smaller than American ones, and with less skilled pilots. The qualitative edge Japan once possessed had evaporated. By spring 1944, American shipyards had delivered more Essex-Class carriers. USS Bunker Hill, USS Wasp, USS Hornet, USS Franklin, USS Ticonderoga, USS Randolph, and USS Hancock had all joined the fleet. These ships, along with light carriers of the Independence class, gave Admiral Mitcher a force of staggering proportions. Task Force 58 now operated with 4 task groups, each built around 3 or 4 carriers. The entire force could sortie with 15 carriers, able to launch over 1,000 aircraft in coordinated strikes. This was air power on a scale never before assembled at sea. The strategic implications were profound. With this force, the U.S. Navy could strike targets across thousands of miles of ocean, support amphibious invasions on multiple fronts, and engage the Japanese fleet with confidence of victory. The Fast Carrier Task Force became the primary instrument of American offensive strategy in the Pacific. The invasion of the Mariana Islands in June 1944 brought the decisive confrontation both navies had been maneuvering toward. The Marianas, particularly Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were considered part of Japan's inner defensive ring. Their loss would bring American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Navy understood it had to respond, had to challenge American control of the sea, or risk losing the war's strategic initiative entirely. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled the mobile fleet, every carrier Japan could scrape together, for a desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion force. Ozawa had 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, with a combined air strength of over 400 aircraft. On paper, it seemed a respectable force, but the reality was far grimmer than the numbers suggested. Many of Ozawa's pilots were inexperienced, their training curtailed by fuel shortages and time pressure. The Japanese carriers themselves were suffering from worn machinery and inadequate maintenance. Nevertheless, Ozawa intended to use Japan's one remaining advantage, the longer range of Japanese carrier aircraft, to strike American carriers before they could respond. The resulting Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought on June 19th and 20th, 1944, became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the name was grimly appropriate. Ozawa launched his strikes early on June 19th, intending to catch the American fleet by surprise. But American radar detected the incoming raids while they were still over 100 miles away. Admiral Mitcher, commanding from USS Lexington, calmly ordered all available fighters launched to intercept. Over 200 Hellcats roared into the sky, directed by fighter controllers watching radar screens to intercept the Japanese strikes before they reached the American fleet. What followed was a massacre. The Japanese formations, inexperienced pilots flying in loose formations, were torn apart by coordinated Hellcat attacks. Lieutenant Raymond Foster, now flying a Hellcat from USS Essex, joined the defensive screen that day. His section intercepted a formation of Japanese Judy dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters. The engagement was shockingly one-sided. Foster and his wingmen dove on the Japanese formation from above, using the Hellcat's superior speed and firepower. The Zeros tried to intervene, but they could not keep up with the diving Hellcats, and when they tried to maneuver for advantage, the Hellcats simply used their superior speed to disengage and attack again. Foster personally shot down 3 Japanese aircraft that day, and he was far from unique. Across the fleet, Hellcat pilots racked up kill after kill. Of the nearly 200 aircraft Ozawa launched in the first raid, only a handful survived to return to their carriers. A second raid suffered similar losses, as did a third and fourth. By evening, Ozawa's air groups had been annihilated. Over 300 Japanese aircraft had been lost for minimal American losses. The numerical advantage Japan had started the day with had evaporated, but the disaster for Japan was not yet complete. The submarine USS Albacore torpedoed and sank the carrier Shokaku, one of the 2 fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Hours later, USS Kavala torpedoed and sank the carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and largest carrier. The loss of 2 fleet carriers in a single day, along with most of Ozawa's air groups, was a catastrophic blow from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. The following day, American scouts located the retreating Japanese fleet. Despite the late hour, Admiral Mitcher made the bold decision to launch a strike even though his aircraft would have to return after dark. A hazardous operation even in peacetime. Over 200 aircraft from the Essex-Class carriers and their consorts launched into the afternoon sky. They caught Ozawa's fleet and delivered devastating attacks, sinking the carrier Hio and damaging several other ships. The return flight was indeed hazardous, with aircraft running low on fuel and pilots struggling to find their carriers in the darkness, but Mitcher ordered all ships to turn on their lights. A dangerous decision that risked submarine attack, but allowed most of the returning aircraft to land safely. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Ozawa had begun the battle with over 400 carrier aircraft and ended with fewer than 30. The pilots lost could not be replaced, not with the skill level needed for carrier operations. From this point forward, Japanese carriers would operate with skeleton air groups or no air groups at all. The Essex-Class carriers and their air wings had achieved what many thought impossible. They had decisively defeated the Japanese carrier force that had once seemed invincible. Admiral Kobayashi, reading reports of the battle from his headquarters in the Philippines, understood that the war at sea was effectively over. Japan had lost the ability to challenge American control of the Pacific. The Essex-Class carriers now roamed at will, their aircraft striking wherever they chose. Japanese merchantmen trying to supply isolated garrisons were hunted down and sunk. Japanese bases were pummeled repeatedly. The once vast Japanese empire was being systematically carved apart, and there was nothing the Japanese Navy could do to prevent it. The invasion of the Philippines in October 1944 brought another desperate Japanese response. With their carrier air groups destroyed, Japanese planners developed a radical new strategy, the kamikaze. Conventional pilot training took too long and consumed too much fuel. Instead, pilots would be given just enough training to take off, fly to a target, and crash into it. The kamikaze concept was born of desperation, an acknowledgement that Japan could no longer match American forces in conventional combat. The Essex-Class carriers would face this new threat at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. The Japanese plan was complex, involving multiple fleets converging on the invasion, beaches to destroy the American amphibious forces. Ozawa's remaining carriers, now serving as decoys with almost no aircraft aboard, would lure the American fast carriers north, while Japanese battleships attacked the landing beaches. The plan partially succeeded in that Admiral Halsey, commanding Third Fleet built around the Essex-Class carriers, did take his force north to engage Ozawa's carriers, but the Japanese had underestimated American strength. Even with the fast carriers racing north, powerful American forces remained to defend the landing area, and the Japanese surface forces were savaged in a series of running gun battles. Halsey's carriers caught Ozawa's force and annihilated it, sinking all 4 Japanese carriers. But the battle also saw the first organized kamikaze attacks against American ships. The Essex-Class carriers, with their heavy anti-aircraft armament and strong construction, proved remarkably resistant to kamikaze damage. When the escort carrier USS St. Lo was sunk by a kamikaze, larger fleet carriers like Essex and Intrepid absorbed hits that would have destroyed smaller ships and continued operating. The combination of armor protection, compartmentalization, and damage control meant that Essex-Class carriers could survive hits that would sink lesser vessels. Through late 1944 and into 1945, the Essex-Class carriers continued their relentless offensive. They supported the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, operations that brought American forces within close range of the Japanese home islands. The carriers struck Japanese air bases on Formosa, Okinawa, and Kyushu repeatedly, trying to suppress Japanese air power before it could threaten invasion forces. The kamikaze threat intensified, with Japanese aircraft deliberately crashing into American ships in suicide attacks. Several Essex-Class carriers suffered kamikaze hits. USS Franklin was nearly destroyed by bombs that penetrated to her hangar deck, triggering massive fires and explosions that killed over 800 men. Yet, even Franklin survived, limped back to port, and was eventually repaired. USS Bunker Hill suffered severe kamikaze damage. USS Intrepid was hit multiple times, and USS Hancock was damaged, but none were sunk. The robust construction of the Essex-Class kept them fighting even when damaged. By spring 1945, American carrier forces began striking Japan itself. Task Force 58 launched raids against Tokyo, Kobe, and Kure, attacking what remained of the Japanese fleet and industrial centers. The sight of American carrier aircraft over Japan's capital was a powerful symbol of America's complete air and sea dominance. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was reduced to scattered ships hiding in harbors, sunk at their moorings by carrier aircraft. They had no means to stop. The giant battleship Yamato, pride of the Japanese fleet, sortied in April 1945 for what was effectively a suicide mission to attack American forces off Okinawa. She never made it. Aircraft from the Essex-Class carriers USS Intrepid, USS Yorktown, USS Langley, and others intercepted the Yamato force and sent the mighty battleship to the bottom under a hail of bombs and torpedoes. The era of the battleship was truly over, killed by carrier aircraft. When World War II ended in August 1945, the U.S. Navy had 17 Essex-Class carriers in commission, with more under construction. This massive fleet had fundamentally transformed naval warfare and had played a decisive role in Japan's defeat. The carriers had projected American air power across thousands of miles of ocean, had supported every major amphibious operation, had destroyed the Japanese fleet piecemeal, and had brought the war to Japan's doorstep. The industrial capacity that built these ships in such numbers had proven as decisive as any tactical victory. Japan, despite fighting with courage and determination, simply could not match American production. Every Essex-Class carrier that arrived in the Pacific represented not just a single ship, but a mobile air base with an air wing larger than entire Japanese air forces in many areas. When multiple carriers operated together, their combined power was irresistible. The human cost of this victory was substantial. Thousands of American sailors and aviators died serving aboard the Essex-Class carriers and their escorts. Men like Lieutenant Raymond Foster, who survived the war, carried memories of friends lost in combat, of aircraft that didn't return, of ships burning under kamikaze attack. But they also carried pride in what they had accomplished. The Essex-Class carriers and their crews had faced an experienced, determined enemy, and had prevailed through a combination of industrial might, technological innovation, tactical skill, and personal courage. Commander Douglas Whitmore, ending the war as captain of USS Hornet, looked back on his time leading air groups from these ships with mixed emotions. The victory had been necessary and just, but the cost in human lives on all sides had been terrible. For Japan, the lesson of the Essex-Class carriers was bitter but clear. The nation had started a war against an industrial power whose capacity they had fundamentally misunderstood. American shipyards had produced not just one or two Essex-Class carriers, but dozens of them. A sustained production effort that Japan could never match. This industrial imbalance, more than any single battle, had determined the war's outcome. By 1945, Japan's navy was effectively destroyed, its air forces shattered, its cities burning under American bomber raids. The Essex-Class carriers had been the instruments of sea control that made this systematic destruction possible. They had protected the invasion fleets, had interdicted Japanese supply lines, had struck Japanese bases and fleets wherever found, and had established American dominance over the Pacific Ocean. The legacy of the Essex-Class extended well beyond World War II. Many of these carriers served into the Cold War era, modernized with angled flight decks, steam catapults, and jet aircraft. They fought in Korea and Vietnam, proving the enduring value of their basic design. Some remained in service into the 1970s, an extraordinary longevity that testified to the soundness of their construction. The operational concepts developed around the Essex-Class, particularly the Fast Carrier Task Force, became the foundation for modern American naval aviation. Today's supercarriers are the descendants of the Essex-Class, vastly larger and more capable, but still based on the fundamental idea that the aircraft carrier is the capital ship of the modern Navy, the platform that projects power across vast distances. The story of how the Essex-Class aircraft carriers stunned Japan and changed the course of the Pacific War is ultimately a story about industrial capacity, innovation, and human determination. American naval architects designed superb ships. American shipyard workers built those ships with remarkable speed and quality. American sailors operated them under grueling conditions. American aviators flew from their decks into desperate combat. Together, this combination of design excellence, industrial might, and human courage created a weapon system that proved decisive in the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy, despite its own considerable skill and courage, could not overcome the fundamental advantage the Essex-Class carriers represented. The ability to build these powerful ships in great numbers, to crew them with trained personnel, to supply them across vast ocean distances, and to operate them effectively under combat conditions, demonstrated American military and industrial power at its peak. Admiral Kobayashi survived the war, and in the years afterward wrote extensively about his experiences. His memoirs contain a passage that captures the Japanese perspective on the Essex-Class carriers better than any American account. He wrote that when he first saw 8 American carriers on the horizon in early 1944, he knew the war was lost. Not because of that single battle, but because the presence of 8 fleet carriers operating together represented a level of industrial and military power that Japan simply could not match. For every carrier Japan built, America built 10. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 100. For every ton of supplies Japan shipped to its forward bases, America shipped 1,000 tons. The Essex-Class carriers were the most visible symbol of this overwhelming material advantage, steel embodiments of American industrial might. They had stunned Japan not through any single devastating attack, though there were many, but through their relentless presence, their constantly growing numbers, and their complete domination of the Pacific. The ocean that Japan had once thought would be its defensive barrier had instead become an American highway, and the Essex-Class carriers had paved that highway with steel flight decks and the thunder of aircraft engines. The age of American naval dominance in the Pacific had arrived on the decks of these remarkable ships, and the world would never be quite the same again.